right, so I'm going to keep this brief and pretty general. I'll, answer more questions about the investigation after. All right. So do you all remember how angry we were when 13 students and teachers were gunned down at Columbine? Or maybe you'll remember how outraged we were when we heard the news of 32 slaughtered at Virginia Tech. I'm sure you remember our indignation of over the 20 elementary students massacred at Sandy Hook. In each situation, we expressed our outrage and our insistence that we could never allow this to happen again, found ourselves in shouting matches over gun laws, and updated our Facebook statuses with our most sincere of condolences. Somehow, despite our valiant and persistent efforts, my community was struck with the massacre of 17 students and teachers. Little to no effective legislation has been passed, and our Facebook statuses have constantly updated with our condolences for the most recent mass shooting. Rather than considering the complexity of the issues at hand, we expressed our outrage in place of actual solutions. This sort of outrage culture is dangerous for two reasons. First, it discourages important conversations, and second, it favors outrage over action. In fact, we've become so blinded by our outrage that we've adopted an us versus them mentality, in which opposing opinion is dismissed as illegitimate, adversaries as uninformed, and criticism as unfair judgment. These recent shootings has made this more apparent now than ever before. The left claims to be proponents of diverse opinion and non-judgmental dialogue, unless, of course, you're a member of the NRA, in which case you're an uneducated, unsympathetic, and have little value for human life. And while conservatives claim to be proponents of free speech, in some cases we, and many of us, have decried protests for gun control as unpatriotic and un-American. This tendency to want to ridicule the other side rather than to reason with them kills important conversation before it even begins. By doing this, we assume that the opposition has nothing to add to the narrative when in fact the opposite is true. Our democracy thrives on opinionated voices from both the left and right, black and white, rich and poor. So when we resort to name-calling and labeling in place of rational discussion, it's not only ineffective at communicating anything other than hostility, but it's also the very antithesis of democracy. You see, this tendency to favor outrage over action does a disservice to those who are actually affected by the issues at hand. Oftentimes we think of these tragedies in terms of numbers and statistics, so allow me to put a face to a name. On February 14th, Meadow Pollock was finishing up her last class period, packing up to go home, and preparing for a romantic Valentine's Day with her boyfriend. Instead, her school was turned into a war zone. She was shot nearly 10 times attempting to save another student. She, along with 16 students and teachers, died at Stoneman that day. The country was outraged. Activists rallied to our community. Sympathetic tweets were sent and prayers were promised, but life moved on. Their outrage has done little for Meadow or her family. Every day that goes by is another day that they're reminded of the senselessness of the massacre, and they struggle to understand why. There's not a thing that we can say or that we can scream that will bring Meadow back or give comfort to her family. There's not a thing that we can say to bring comfort to her family, but we can work together towards ensuring that such senseless and preventable tragedy does not strike again. You see, if we insist that we can never allow this to occur again while doing nothing more than expressing our outrage, when children are being gunned down in our schools, then we are willing participants in their deaths. So long as we continue to find comfort in complacency, we haven't a right to say that we care. And 3 months ago, I was as guilty of this as anyone. I was desensitized to the news of constant mass shootings and considered them nothing more than a harsh reality of the world that we live in. It wasn't until tragedy struck my community that I realized I couldn't remain a silent observer any longer. So over the course of the last 3 months, I've conducted an extensive investigation into the Broward County School Board and the superintendent. The findings of the investigation were twofold. First, there are over $100 million in school safety funds that the district failed to spend prior to the shooting at Stoneman Douglas that could have saved lives. In 2014, Broward Schools was granted around $130 million specifically for school safety funds that would be distributed over a 5-year period. In the last 4 years, major project delays have led to only 5% of that money being spent. One of those delayed projects was a new fire system for Stoneman Douglas that was supposed to be a year-one priority. Broward's former director of school safety recommended that the alarms include a positive alarm sequence, which would allow the office to determine if there's an actual fire before allowing the alarm to sound. When Stoneman's alarm was triggered, students fled from their classrooms directly into the line of fire. Had the district implemented the new system on time and with the recommended upgrades, 6 students on the 3rd floor would likely have survived, including Meadow Pollock. The second part of my investigation focused on discipline programs. In Broward, we have discipline programs that allow potentially dangerous students like the shooter to remain in traditional public schools. In an effort to address disproportionate minority arrests, our superintendent and district implemented new programs such as the Behavior Intervention Program and the Promise Program, which in essence, the district and the sheriff's office signed an agreement to reshape school discipline by avoiding arrests. As a result, troubled students who previously would have been referred to law enforcement are now entered into rehabilitation programs. Within our years, our arrest rate plummeted and our violent crime rate went through the roof. When I brought this to the attention of the board and superintendent, they labeled my claims fake news, and one of our board members even went as far as to say my allegations were appalling and suggested that I was exploiting the bloodshed for personal gain. Less than a month later, I've been vindicated. It was recently reported that contrary to the claims of the superintendent and the district, the shooter actually avoided arrest by being referred to one of these programs. The superintendent has now admitted to that. So through my investigation, I realized that this tragedy was completely and totally preventable. So I partnered with Meadow's dad, Andrew Pollock, to work on a nonprofit named Class, in which will serve as a watchdog for school districts across the country to ensure that they're held accountable in the interest of transparency. I'm also working on electing new school board members who will fix the system that failed our students. So through tragedy, I've found a way to funnel my outrage towards something productive. So I don't mean to discount or minimize our outrage. In fact, it's the opposite. I encourage it. Outrage has been used to wage revolution, fuel counterculture, and as an agent of change throughout history. Slaves who dreamt of freedom used their outrage to fight for emancipation. The women at the Seneca Falls Convention used their outrage to ensure that their votes and voices were just as valid as men's. And the men and women of the civil rights era used their outrage to create a nation in which they were judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. So I'm not saying that our outrage is not important. What I'm saying is that it's not enough. That outrage serves best as a predecessor to action. Our outrage isn't going to fill the stomachs of starving children. It's not going to home the homeless or bring back the latest victim of a school shooting. And while it seems almost trivial to say that, it seems far too often we forget it somewhere in between tweeting our condolences and expressing our outrage. Because while politicians, community members, and activists offer their most sincere of condolences and manufactured outrage, we as students are burdened with attending schools that may at any moment be turned into war zones. If you truly feel outraged by the recent string of mass shootings, I ask that you remember that our outrage is not nearly as impactful as our actions. Martin Luther King spoke truth to this when he said that history will have to record that the greatest tragedy in this period of social transition was not the strident clamor of the bad people, but the appalling silence of the good ones. So should we be so foolish as to believe that our silent outrage is enough? Then let us be damned. Let those children be damned to unsafe schools, the homeless to homelessness, our government to greed, this nation to partisanship, and this world to endless cynicism. Because the blame lies squarely on us. But if you too believe that it is time to translate our anger into action, then I simply allow that you remember that we not allow this nation to be known by its fixation with indignation, but to its commitment for change. Thank you. If anybody has any questions, I'd love to answer them. I actually want to address something a gentleman said or asked earlier about other counties with these same programs. So the Promise program that we received is unique to Broward County, but it was sort of formed upon federal guidelines from the Obama administration and Arne Duncan's education department. Those guidelines basically said that districts that had disproportionate minority arrest rates would be investigated. So districts in New York City and Chicago, obviously in Broward, implemented these changes, and as a result, we're seeing things like the Promise program. There are actually a lot of counties in Florida who are currently being investigated by the Justice Department for not implementing those same changes, to answer your question.
Do you think it has a practical solution on the high school campus? I work in high school now.
Sure.
I remember when I was in high school back in the 70s, we used to have driver's ed. We did simulators. Even though we never owned a car, really drove a car, but we learned how, the dangers of driving. Would that be a good example, a way to say take the kids on a field trip to the gun show, to the gun range, and teach them how to shoot?
I think that'd be a little hard to get community support for, but hey, listen, I'm open to it.
Are there enough students who you're inspiring to do what you're doing?
I'm inspired by a lot of the students that I've already seen stand up, even those that I don't necessarily agree with. We sort of have a unique opportunity at the moment to enact change that we really haven't been able to do in any other circumstance, in any other mass shooting, because of how vocal our community has been. And I think in part that has to do with the sort of systematic failures that we've been seeing coming out of Broward County. So yeah, I hope that our work shines a little bit of light on that. I've spoken to some of the more controversial figures on the left that I think you can imagine who I'm talking about, and they also recognize the need to address these issues and these failures. So yeah, I think there are a lot of students that are sort of moving towards that, and I'm inspired by their work as well. Absolutely, 100%.
I don't know anything about the Promise Program.
Sure.
The first time I heard it was this guy back there mentioning it. So are you saying it's a federal program that you can't change, you were trying to change? And everyone knew about this guy, even the federal government, FBI, and nobody did anything. So I don't understand how what you're trying to do.
Yeah, I got to remember we're not in Broward.
We're not in Broward, no.
So the Promise Program is not a federal program. That is something that is unique to Broward County. It was born out of federal guidelines that sort of those dear colleague letters and things that threatened investigation if we did not address our racial bias issues, right? So to follow those guidelines, we sort of implemented this program. It's not a federal program. And essentially what the Promise Program is it lists 13 misdemeanors that we no longer arrest for. Instead, we send the student to rehabilitation programs. Now, the issue with that is they keep saying that this program has a 90% success rate. That students that come into this program, 90% of them don't reoffend. It's completely untrue. The shooter was referred to the program. He was never entered into it. They didn't even follow up with him. So, yeah, he was referred, and it's not just the Promise Program. We have a discipline matrix that allows teachers and administrators to have full discretion over the punishment that a student receives, even in the case that it's a felony. If it's a felony, they don't have a requirement to report it to police. They can sweep it under the rug and refer them to a program and do something of that sort. Hi.
Is there any way what happened? Is there any movement afoot to rescind that?
Yeah, Betsy DeVos is actually currently looking at the guidelines federally, which I'm very excited about, which would roll those back and discourage other districts from doing the same. Yeah. Yeah, the FBI is a problem in and of itself, but again, if we had stricter discipline, look, the kid brought bullets to school. He threatened to kill his classmates. Had he been arrested, had he been charged, had he been convicted, he would have been on the FBI's radar, even more so than they already had. They would have had grounds to, the reason the FBI said that they didn't take him in, and they said they didn't really have probable cause or a few other things. But had he had an arrest, had they known the things that he was doing in and out of school, he more than likely would have been detained. Hi.
I wanted to say, I don't know if this just came into my head, because I flew recently, and couldn't we do TSA light at the schools? Like metal detect? I mean, I don't think I'm being original.
Yeah.
But it seems like anyway.
Yeah, there are a lot of possible solutions. For me, at first I was very interested in seeing metal detecting wands implemented in schools, at which I learned a little bit more about it, and I realized that it would take hours upon hours to load these students into the schools. So this is really going to be a school-by-school basis kind of thing. There are going to be some schools that require very heavy security. It also has to do with the way that the schools are set up, but yeah, metal detectors are something that can be considered. I'm not sure how effective it would be at this time, but that's sort of why what we're trying to do is make Broward County an example to the rest of the country of what the best a school district can be. So we'll use Broward County as a test subject. We'll try metal detectors, we'll try bulletproof windows, we'll try whatever it takes, and once it's successful, we'll roll that out to the rest of the country.
A lot of the students that have gotten the national spotlight, like you, for speaking out on both sides of this issue, seem to be extraordinarily well-spoken, have great stage presence, are very well media savvy and dealing with the media. Why are there so many students from Parkland that are so well trained to, that's the only word I can think of, adept, if you will, at being in front of, I don't think a single student from my high school would have had the ability to do what you guys are doing. So why?
Well, Parkland actually can't claim me. I'm from Pembroke Pines, another city in Broward. But something that you'll see amongst a lot of the students, as much as I'm critical of the public schooling system that we have, it definitely provided me with the ability to do what I'm doing today. I spent 4 years in debate. I learned how to research arguments, how to present arguments. I went into that, one of the shyest kids in my class, and came out of that performing at national tournaments, Harvard, so on and so forth. So I have a lot of faith in the public school system, not necessarily the people leading the public school systems. Thank you, guys.